In this video, we will create this exploded axonometric diagram using SketchUp and Illustrator. If you'd like to download the files that we're using in this tutorial, there's a link below in the description. There are a bunch of different ways you can do an exploded axonometric diagram. There isn't a right or wrong way to do a drawing like this. Really what it comes down to is the final quality of the drawing, how much time it takes you to get there, and really just what software do you feel comfortable using. I've always had a lot of success using SketchUp and Illustrator to do a diagram like this. So in this video, I'm going to show you my step-by-step process, and hopefully it'll give you some ideas that you can apply towards your workflow for your next diagram. So we'll start in our SketchUp model. And here, the first thing you're going to notice is I've got just about every single line that we're going to use in Illustrator inside of SketchUp. The reason for this is I want to minimize the amount of time we're in Illustrator. I want to spend as much time designing in 3D as possible. The first step is to create the exploded effect for our diagram inside of SketchUp. To do this, I've made 3 copies of my building. Each copy is its own individual group. And then inside of each of those groups are section planes. And of course, these section planes are going to allow us to control what parts of our building are visible for each layer. I've also gone ahead and added the lines inside of SketchUp that kind of connect the different layers of the building together. You can see they're just a group that I've created a layer called dash and changed the line type to dash lines. Notice how I'm being very intentional about the parts of my project that I'm exploding. I'm actually leaving that little exterior pavilion grounded. And I'm okay with that because it's not going to obstruct the final view of my exploded building. The next thing I wanted to touch on is the level of detail inside of this model. The most important things that I find to almost always be bogging down my model are railings and furniture. So if you can keep these elements as 2D, flat planes, or just line work, it's going to save you so much time when you get to Illustrator. And the best part is your model is going to be faster and the file size is going to be smaller. For this project, the SketchUp model is about 5 megabytes, which is typically what I shoot for something that is this scale. So check this out. All of my people are inside of SketchUp. They're all simplified 2D people that are face me components in SketchUp. So no matter what my view is, I know the people are going to be flat to the camera and give me the same effect that I would have if I place them in Illustrator. The cool thing about placing your people in SketchUp is you're going to get shadow information, which is awesome and a little bit tricky to do if you're trying to do it in Illustrator. The next thing I wanted to point out are kind of my service or restroom spaces that I don't really want to call much attention to. So what I've done is I've actually just created a flat 2D plane and I put it on top of those spaces so that once we get to Illustrator, I'll be able to select that plane and add a hatch to it. Now we can talk about the context, which is very important for a drawing like this. You can see all of my trees are also in SketchUp, and these are all 2D components that I'm going to be able to get shadow information from. What I'm showing here is just a little trick I use to create a little bit different scale and variation between the different trees. Now, every project is different. They're all set in different locations. For this one, mine's obviously kind of in a remote forested area next to water. And what I've tried to do with my context is create a story. You know, I have a street driving past my building. I have a boat ramp. I put a sailboat in the water. There's kayaks that are docked next to my little restaurant. There's even a bear walking in the woods. It's all of these things that are going to come together to make the drawing quality very rich and tell a story in the end. Now remember, you have to keep all of these models lightweight. Even the kayaks that I have are very simple 2D flat planes that aren't going to bog down my model. This fire pit is another 2D PNG that I found on Google that I traced and imported into SketchUp, just like I did the trees. Even the bike on the bike path and the person riding the bike, it's all imported into SketchUp as silhouettes so that I know I don't have to go through the trouble of adding this in Illustrator. I have a few different scenes set up in my SketchUp model. The first one is called Axo View. This is only to save the camera angle that I want for my exploded drawing. And of course, this is set in parallel projection. Next, I have a color by layer scene, which is only saving the style and shadow settings. Here, I've gone into my edge settings and made it by color by material, and then I've turned on color by tag in my tags panel. Now, all of our objects, line work, are colored based on the layer they are on. This is going to be extremely important when we get to Illustrator to adjust our different line weights. I have a scene that's called working, and of course this is what it sounds like. This is the style that I'm typically working in. It just is shaded with edges shown. The next one is just called shaded, and this has all the edges turned off and materials turned on. We will use this export in Illustrator to select faces to add patterns and fills. Finally, we have a scene called shadows, and this only has shadows turned on. So I've turned off edges, profiles, and I chose a hidden line style. And then I've adjusted my shadow settings to be 100% light and 0% dark. And this is going to create a black and white scenario that I'm going to be able to use in Illustrator to actually add shadows to my final drawing. The last thing I wanted to touch on before we export to Illustrator are the layers. I have quite a few layers in my model, but that might not always be necessary. Think of your layers as line weights. Anytime you have a new layer, a different line weight can easily be applied to that layer in Illustrator, such as your railings. You might want those to be thinner than the rest of your lines in your drawing. Now we're ready to export to Illustrator. And in this video, we're actually going to use layout to export. And the reason for this is because SketchUp is not very good at maintaining aspect ratio whenever you're exporting to Illustrator. What I mean by this is if you were to export what's on the screen now, and then later on you need to make changes and you accidentally shifted your panel and you exported it again, these are not going to line up correctly in Illustrator, and it's going to be very frustrating. So to mitigate this problem, we're actually going to use layout, which is going to be able to lock the aspect ratio for us. Now we're going to open up layout, and in layout, we're going to create a new document. I just chose A3. And then if you go to document setup, you can go ahead and change the dimensions of the page to whatever you want. I'm doing 16 by 9 inches. Now we're ready to import our SketchUp model. So make sure you saved your model, locate it, and open it up after you do File, Insert, and Layout. And then it's going to load right onto the center of your sheet. Then you can scale it and adjust it to the size that you'd like. And then I just right-click and I'm clicking center horizontally and vertically on the page so I know it's right in the middle. Now I'm going to create 2 more pages because I know I need to export 3 different things to Illustrator. Just like my scenes in SketchUp, I'm calling one color by layer, one shaded, and one shadows. My color by layer page looks great. I just copied and pasted onto my shaded layer, right-clicked, selected the correct scene for shaded, and then did the same for shadows. Next, make sure each of your viewports are set to raster. So if you select the viewport off to the right in the SketchUp model tab, you'll see a raster option. This will keep your layout file very fast. But we actually want them to be vector when we export. So if you go to document setup and to rendering, there's a little box you can check to override the output from raster to vector, which is exactly what we want. And I almost forgot, before we export this, we need to turn off the glass panes in our model. This is because if you export a vector from SketchUp, anything that is behind a transparent object is going to be lost. So luckily, I have all my glass panes set on a layer. So inside a layout, I can go to my SketchUp model tab, into my tags, and turn off the glass. And this is important because we want to get all the information and line work that is behind the glass. I also did this for the water. Now we're ready to export to Illustrator. So go ahead and do File, Export, PDF, and then change the range from pages 1 to 2, because these are the only 2 pages that we want to be vector. The third page, shadows, we're going to export as a rasterized image, because for some reason, Layout really doesn't like to export shadows as vector. So I just changed the override option to off. So this will actually export as a raster JPEG in a PDF format. Finally, if you remember, we turned off our glass panes, and I actually want a fill in Illustrator that I can add a transparency to indicate glass. So to do this, just to make it clear, in SketchUp, I'm making my water and my glass red because this is the information that I want. So I saved my SketchUp model, went back to layout, updated the model reference in the viewport, and then in my tags layer, I made sure my glass was turned on. Now we can export this as a vector, and then when we get to Illustrator, I'll be able to select those red filled areas and get the information we need to create what looks like glass for my building. And this is a good example of how you can work back and forth between SketchUp and layout, and then ultimately to Illustrator. Now we can open our PDFs that we exported from layout in Illustrator. This includes color by layer, shaded, the shadows, and finally the glass and water that we exported last. We're going to use our color by layer PDF as our base Illustrator file. What I've done is just created a bunch of new layers in this file. And now I'm going to organize all my different colored lines onto their own layers. I do this by selecting one of the lines and then doing select same appearance. And if you set up a hotkey for this, this process goes very quickly. But remember, I'm a little crazy and I have about 20 layers in this drawing, when in reality, I probably could have gotten away with 5 or 6. So just keep that in mind whenever you're dealing with your layer organization in SketchUp. Be very intentional about how many layers you have and how that's going to affect the amount of customization you have over your line weights in Illustrator. This is a pretty repetitive process, so I'm just going to speed it up so we can get to the next step, which is to label all of your layers, because being organized is important, especially when you have a complex file. The way I like to name my layers is based on if they have lines, fills, or patterns. So for the color by layer export, most of them are just lines, right? So I'll name these layers lines, dash, and then whatever is actually on that layer. Once again, repetitive process, so I'll speed it up, but just know this is extremely important to be organized, especially if you're working with teammates or coworkers and they have to get into this file later. So make sure you're organized and efficient when naming your layers. The next thing I like to do after all my layers are named is select all the lines in the drawing and make them black. I noticed that the line weight was a little too thick for the overall drawing, so I selected all the lines again and changed the line weight to 0.1. And this is just going to be a really good starting point as we begin to adjust our line weights. And you can already see this is getting very close to the final drawing that we're after. I knew I wanted to incorporate color in this drawing, kind of a dark blue. So I created a global color swatch that I'm able to apply to all my lines. And it's important that it's a global color swatch because later on, after I've applied the same color to a bunch of different objects and lines in my drawing, I'll be able to easily change the color to kind of test and see what works best for the drawing without having to go through each individual layer and changing the color. Here, I just selected all of the fills from the section cut that was exported from SketchUp, and I used Pathfinder to make it one shape. I gave it a white fill and then a thicker line for the outline. Next is really the only manual task that we'll have to do for this drawing. And it's to create a thicker profile line that is going to highlight the important parts of my project. And I always like to start off and do this pretty early on because to me, this can make the biggest impact to the quality of a drawing. So what I've done here is I'm using a 1.75 line thickness for this line. And if you remember, every other line is 0.1. So this is much, much thicker than the typical line in my drawing, which allows me to be pretty free and not have to spend too much time making this a perfect outline. At the end of the day, it's going to really create that punch that we want for our drawing to kind of pop off of the page and grab the viewer's attention. Every drawing is different, and every diagram is trying to highlight something unique. So be sure that you use these thicker lines carefully and apply them to areas where you want the viewer's eye to be drawn to. I can't stress that enough. Here I noticed that some of the detail on my trees was a little thick. So luckily I had that on its own layer. So I selected that layer, changed the line weight, and even lowered the opacity a bit. I felt like I needed to add a profile line to this little exterior pavilion. So this one isn't as thick as the primary building, but it's still going to help us make this stand off the page as one of the primary elements in the drawing. If you remember, we actually added dashed lines in SketchUp that connected the exploded parts of the building. They're on their own layer, so I can easily select them, adjust the line weight, and the spacing for the dashes. Another line that I wanted to manually add is the cut line that you would get from cutting through the glass panes. Now I can get this from SketchUp. This is just such an easy thing that I wanted to add a new line so I could easily control the thickness of it and the color. And really, this is when you can kind of take a step back and look at the line work, only the line work for the drawing, and pick out any areas that you think need to be refined a bit. Because we did such a good job with our layer organization, we can easily select wide swaths of lines and adjust their line weights without having to select individual pieces of the drawing. And there's really no right or wrong thickness for lines. Every drawing is going to be different. The more drawings you do, the better eye you're going to have for a representation like this. And in turn, you're going to know, in general, kind of what some of the baseline thicknesses for lines that you'll want to use in your drawing. Now we're ready to bring in our shadows. If you remember, when we exported them, they are rasterized. And I actually want to make them vector. So in Illustrator, I'm going to select the image and image trace them. As you can see, it makes them a little cartoony, which I'm actually okay with. I think it gives a pretty cool effect. Now I can create a new layer in my base file, call it shadows, paste and place the shadows, and then adjust the opacity to my liking. The cool thing is, because this is vector, after we image trace it, I can actually select my shadow fill and make it that global color that I have in my drawing. So now my shadows are actually kind of a blue tint, which matches the rest of the theme. Next, I'm ready to bring in the glass panes we exported from SketchUp. So I go to that file, select all of those red panes, go back to my base file, create a layer, call it fill-glass, paste in place, and then adjust the color. I ended up going with pretty much a white, and then I lowered the opacity to about 75%, so you can start to see some stuff behind the glass. And just like we did the glass, now is when we can have some fun and use that shaded export we did from SketchUp to start applying color and patterns to different surfaces in the model. So first, I'm going to actually do the grass. So you can see I easily selected all of the grass in my model because I made that one color in SketchUp. Made a new layer in my base file, called it fill-grass, pasted it, and then I'm able to adjust the color. Doing the same thing for the road. And you'll see I'm applying that same global color swatch, that navy blue. And then I'm just adjusting the lightness of that color to kind of create a hierarchy and the effect that they're actually different. But they're still all tied back to that global swatch, including the water, which I knew I wanted to be a little bit darker. So I made it that navy swatch, and I lowered the opacity just a little bit. And that's going to be kind of the darkest element on the drawing. And next, I wanted to give my roof a little bit of a fill, a very light blue shade. Because I had that also painted in SketchUp with the material, I'm easily able to select that in my shaded export, paste it in place into my base file, and adjust the color. I did the same for those restroom storage MEP areas. I selected the fill in the shaded file, then created a new layer in my base file and just made that kind of a light blue. I actually was planning to have 2 different colors for my furniture, but ultimately I felt like it wasn't necessary. So even though I had 2 different materials in SketchUp, I just selected each of them, pasted them onto the same layer, and then made them kind of the same fill, a very light blue. And you can use this process to highlight or color just about anything in your project. I didn't choose to color everything, and you might choose to color more or less. It just depends on the drawing and what you're trying to illustrate for your viewer. Here, I actually wanted my people to stand out a little bit, so I actually added a second color. Once again, a global swatch, so I can easily change it later. And I made it kind of an orangey yellow that complemented the blue very nicely. The last thing I wanted to do here before we wrap up was add some textures to my drawing. And these are all basic textures that you can find built into Illustrator. So it's nothing fancy. If you want to use these exact same textures, you can go to the link in the description and download these files. They're obviously included in the Illustrator file. And this is the exact same process as the filled regions. Anytime I want to apply a pattern somewhere, all I need is that shaded area from my shaded export. And here I added a little pattern to the floor. It's kind of like a wood pattern. I added my favorite pattern for the grass, which is kind of like a sprinkled effect. And you can see just how easy that was for all the grass in my project. Because I painted the grass before I got to Illustrator inside of SketchUp, it only takes about 5 seconds to apply that pattern. And remember, this is a diagram, so take advantage of the fact that not everything needs to be perfectly to scale when it comes to textures and patterns. So you can have a lot of fun and be creative about how you represent different things. Maybe a concrete is just simple dots. Maybe water is actually a diagonal hatch pattern, which is what I ended up doing here. I'm really having fun with it, and I'm not too worried about scale or realism. I'm more so after what is going to be legible and easy for the viewer to understand and digest my project. And if you don't know where to start, I always go to Pinterest or Instagram or Google Images and just search axonometric diagram or architectural diagram illustration. And those are going to be your best tools for finding and discovering new ways to illustrate your drawings, whether it be patterns like this or color palettes and things of that nature. Finally, the last pattern I wanted to add was just a diagonal hatch that went over those MEP storage areas. So I made a copy of my fill layer, and then I actually added that hatch pattern on top of it, just to give a little bit more interest to an area that was kind of a larger portion of fill. Now we're ready to export our final drawing. I always recommend exporting as a PNG at the highest quality. Before we view our final drawing, remember how that was a global color swatch? This is why, because now you can easily adjust the color of all the lines, patterns, fills in your drawing, just in case you weren't fully in love with that first color you chose. Same with the people. Because that's its own separate color, I can actually change those independently of the other blue color that's in my model. And here's our final drawing. As you can see, it's that wide 16:9 aspect ratio, which is great because now we have the flexibility to actually frame it. For instance, if this was going on Instagram or into your portfolio on an 8.5:11 portrait spread, you can easily crop and adjust the size of this to your liking. Once again, if you're interested in downloading these files to practice on, or even steal some of the entourage, trees, stuff like that, there's a link below in the description that'll take you to the download page. I hope this video was helpful and you're able to take some things from this workflow and apply them towards the next exploded axonometric drawing you do. Let me know if you have any specific questions in the comments below, and thank you for watching.